Hello, everybody. It's good to be here with you. My name is Kyle White. I'm an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, which is a federally recognized tribe in Oklahoma. And I'm a professor at the University of Michigan in the School for Environment and Sustainability. And I'm super thrilled to be here with the colleagues that worked on the chapter, including a number of authors and staff who participated and who will be sharing with you some of the findings from our work on this chapter. I'd like to turn it over to get us started to our colleague, Eliza Lustig.
Great. Thank you so much, Kyle. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Eliza Lustig, and I am on the National Climate Assessment Team at the U.S. Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP. Before we get started, I want to draw your attention to a note that just appeared in the chat. So mics are disabled for all participants today, but if you have any questions or comments throughout the presentation, please enter them in the chat. If you have any difficulties, please contact Tia Biggs, who is our technical support person today. And please note that all participants are expected to be respectful and considerate towards others per the USGCRP Code of Conduct. Alrighty, next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to kick off our webinar today with some background information about the National Climate Assessment before turning it over to the Tribes and Indigenous Peoples chapter authors. Next slide. So the U.S. Global Change Research Program was mandated by Congress in the Global Change Research Act of 1990 to do as it says on this slide, to assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to the human-induced and natural processes of global change. The program convenes 15 different federal agencies to advance climate and global change science and to provide useful and usable information to decision makers. And all 15 of those agencies' seals are here on the slide. Next, please. So that same law that established the program also mandates a periodic scientific assessment known as the National Climate Assessment, or as you will hear it referred to, the NCA. The NCA is a quadrennial report. It analyzes the effects of global change on several sectors, the natural environment, agriculture, energy, land and water resources, transportation, human health, social systems, and biodiversity. We're charged with assessing current trends as well as projections for the next 25 to 100 years. The NCA is used by organizations and individuals for a variety of different reasons, including national policymaking, risk management in the private sector, local mitigation, adaptation planning, and by practitioners, utility managers, and educators. Next slide. Okay, so the NCA authors review a very large body of scientific research from diverse information sources. They synthesize that information, they examine the confidence in their scientific understanding, and they evaluate uncertainties. NCA5 was written by over 500 authors and 200 technical contributors from every state in the nation, as well as Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, and Palau. The NCA is designed to be policy relevant. And when I say that, I mean that authors are distilling their findings into accessible language. It's framed around risk to people and to important resources. That said, the report is strictly not policy prescriptive. So we are not advocating for a particular viewpoint or policy measure. The NCA uses a range of future projections to help people understand the fullest possible extent of risk that can be avoided or reduced under different scenarios of the future. And it leaves it up to the decision maker to ultimately determine their risk threshold. So that kind of relates back to what I was saying about being policy neutral. The assessment is compliant with all applicable federal laws and policies. That includes the Global Change Research Act that mandates the existence of the report in the first place, but there are also a lot of different federal laws that govern things like information quality, accessibility, transparency, etc. And then finally, the report involves a very extensive review process, as our authors can attest. That includes several opportunities for public comment. It includes a review by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and several government science reviews. Okay, next slide, please. Alrighty, so now let's take a look at the NCA5 table of contents. Like previous NCAs, NCA5 covers national level topics, regions, and response actions. So the report opens with an overview chapter that's followed by 2 chapters dedicated to the physical science of climate change. And then there are the national topics listed here, as well as 10 regional chapters and 2 response chapters, although it is critical to note that response actions are also discussed throughout the report, including in the Tribes and Indigenous Peoples chapter. This table of contents has evolved over time, and that has been in part informed by user input by the communities who use this report. So NCA5 actually added 2 new chapters, one on economics, highlighted here in blue, and one on social systems and justice. We also have 5 new focus feature boxes. So those are actually elected by the authors themselves and include compound extreme events, Western wildfires, COVID-19, supply chains, and blue carbon. And then finally, we have several appendices, including one new one dedicated to indicators of climate change. So, I'm ready now to pass it over to the author team. I want to say that I see a couple people have your hands raised. Mics are disabled during the presentation. So please, if you have questions or comments, feel free to put those in the chat. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce Kyle White, the chapter lead of the Tribes and Indigenous Peoples chapter, who will lead us through the remaining webinar today. Thank you, Kyle.
Yeah, and thank you, Eliza, and thank you for all your service to this effort and to ensuring that we have the best climate change information to guide decision making. I wanted to begin by first saying that one of the significant historical aspects of the National Climate Assessment has been the involvement of Indigenous people in the assessment process. And so this is not the first time that there's been a chapter focused on tribes and Indigenous people. And each assessment, the chapters on tribes and Indigenous people become richer, differentiated. They have new aspects. They look at new literatures and sources of information. And so it's really important to uplift this long tradition of Indigenous involvement and leadership. And one of the highlights of this assessments chapter is that the majority of authors are Indigenous persons, as well as colleagues and allies that work for Indigenous and Indigenous serving organizations. And so I wanted to get us started by talking about some of the key knowledge that we were able to establish in this chapter. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, we're joined by several of the authors who will also be sharing about their insights and knowledge regarding some of the key points that we developed in this chapter. And so the first key message is that Indigenous people face risks to well-being and livelihoods from climate change and barriers to energy sovereignty. And the way that we summarize this is that climate change continues to cause negative effects on critical aspects of Indigenous people's well-being. And this includes their livelihoods, health, nutrition, and cultural practices, as well as the ecological resilience of their territories. One of the important parts of this particular statement is that we were trying to build on the knowledge that had already been established that Indigenous people are among the populations that are facing risks of negative effects. And so we reviewed all of the new information since the last climate assessment, and we found that these risks continue to be a very severe issue that Indigenous people are facing, and it doesn't seem to have improved in terms of the susceptibility of Indigenous people to a number of different climatic risks and climate change impacts. And so we assign this very high confidence. But we also expanded the coverage of topics in this section to talk about a number of different ways in which Indigenous people are responding. And so we have a part in this key message that relates to energy sovereignty and other proactive measures that Indigenous people are taking. And one of the ideas here is that Indigenous people are not just seeing climate change as something that they are facing negative risks passively, but they're taking proactive long-term measures, including in the energy sector, to be able to mitigate climate change, to plan for climate change, and to respond to serious climate change adaptation issues. So I'd like to move us forward in our presentation, and I'm going to turn it to my colleague, Dominique David Chavez.
Thanks, Kyle. Labrika, everyone. Welcome, everyone. Dominica Aita Inaru, David Chavez Diri, Orikenarawa Kibaro Tainadaka, Hongwai. So I'm letting you know who I am, also in our Indigenous Caribbean language. My family is native to the U.S. Caribbean. And thanking you for being here. I'm really grateful to have been part of this effort and to be able to share it with so many of you that are joining us. And also in my academic professional role, I direct the Indigenous Land and Data Stewards Lab at Colorado State University's Department of Forest and Rangeland Stewardship, where a lot of my work focuses on community-driven climate resilience research. And I'm going to share our second key message with you from our assessment. Our second key message is that self-determination is key to Indigenous peoples' resilience to climate change. And our findings from this assessment learned with very high confidence based on the volume and breadth of information that we were able to locate, that by exercising their right to self-determination, Indigenous peoples can respond to climate change in ways that meet the needs and aspirations of their communities. And that this ability to exercise this right is often undermined by institutions and policies that have been shaped by impacts of settler colonialism. Again, with very high confidence, looking at that relationship. And also with high confidence that expanded support from federal and state governments has the potential to uphold Indigenous rights to self-determination for guiding climate resilience. And so within this key message, some of the areas we're able to highlight, if you want to look into more detail in the chapter, are looking at consultation, really understanding various ways tribal consultation is being implemented, both effectively and where more work needs to be done in terms of impact and effectiveness. Just seeing some of the findings around that. There's an area that's fairly new for this chapter, also looking at Indigenous data for governance and Indigenous governance of data. So that's an area we were able to explore a little further around just differences among Indigenous peoples' access to data that they need for environmental and climate decision-making, for example, and looking at some of the changes among climate research projects around Indigenous peoples' authority as far as what questions are being asked, what type of data is being gathered for timely and effective decision-making. And then another area we also highlight is Indigenous organizational support, thinking about the importance or effectiveness of urban Indigenous organizations and intertribal organizations to addressing climate adaptation needs. And we can shift to the next slide. So our third key messages is Indigenous leadership guides climate change response. And with high confidence, understanding that Indigenous peoples lead numerous actions that respond to climate change, and that Indigenous-led organizations, initiatives, and movements have demonstrated diverse strategies for climate adaptation and mitigation that are guided by Indigenous knowledges and values and by the pursuit of Indigenous rights. And so in this chapter, there's so many different areas and cases where this is demonstrated through ecological restoration efforts, cultural burning, climate adaptive agricultural practices, and hazard mitigation in terms of coastal change, fire, and flooding, for example. We also share about youth-led movements that are taking place at all different levels, including in international forums, and some of the diverse ways that Indigenous peoples are communicating about climate change, such as through art and storytelling. And so this is a chapter where, unique to Indigenous tribes and Indigenous peoples in this chapter, we were able to really assess and see the way that Indigenous sciences and also Indigenous knowledge systems are being applied and have been applied for centuries and millennia. So we can go to the next slide. And this slide, this is showing Indigenous peoples' lands, Indigenous territories within the US. And so these are customary lands or traditional lands. This is from the native lands data, available data. And you can see here the continental US, Borican or Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands, Guam and Mariana Islands, Hawaii, Alaska, and there wasn't data available, but also, of course, reference to American Samoa, and really showing here just that that these are all indigenous lands first and foremost. Some of these areas where you can see the darker shading are showing overlap between territories, showing those relationships between different Native nations and indigenous peoples' territories. And for our chapter, really also showing the impossible task of over 700 Native nations and indigenous peoples communities that we were really trying to synthesize in this assessment. But we had a great author team. We had some great assets available to us, including the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals STAC report, or Status of Tribes and Climate Change report. And so those are some areas we can also point folks to, to do the impossible task that we couldn't do. And I'll go ahead and turn it back to my colleague, Kyle.
Thank you very much, Dominique. Really important information. And I'd like to move to the next part of our presentation and introduce our colleague, Nicholas Bruscato.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Kyle, Dominique, Eliza, and Chaz. My name is Nick. When I started this process, I was a tribal liaison at FEMA, working in Region 5 on developing climate risk data and capacity building around that with tribes in the Upper Great Lakes. I have since moved to the Department of the Interior in International Affairs under the Office of the Secretary, continuing to work in technical assistance and capacity building, and looking at connecting Indigenous folks from around the world with some of the great work that we're doing here. And looking at this slide, figure 16.2, it builds perfectly off of the last slide that Dominique presented. It's important, one, to note the colonial context for which the current state of tribal land is. This map shows federally recognized reservations, trust land, and then also the federal lands that are held. It also is important to note the close proximity geographically of reservations, federal trust land, and federal lands. Those federal lands are national parks, national forests, wilderness areas, and just an understanding that there is joint utilization of these spaces, but also often a relegation and a displacement that has come to the establishment of these places. We highlighted in this portion the growth of co-management and co-stewardship agreements between federally recognized tribes and the US federal government in this in some of these spaces. Since this report has been published over the last few months, there has been an expansion of those agreements. So this is incredibly timely. We've highlighted two areas, Grand Portage, Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, and in northern Minnesota, in proximity to Grand Portage, as well as southern Florida. We have seen a huge opportunity here as well in noting how these spaces can be utilized to adapt to climate change, as well as preserve treaty rights as well. So I'll pass it back to Kyle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. One of the really exciting aspects of the chapter was some of the advancements that we were able to make regarding Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous worldviews. And this figure here is an important example of what I mean. And when we reviewed the information for the chapter, we found that when Indigenous people articulate their worldviews, when they articulate their knowledge, they are articulating longstanding and extremely complex ways of understanding how human societies relate to the environment. And it's not just information about how currently living humans relate to the environment, but also what we can learn from the past and what our relationships are to people of the past, but also what our actions today mean for future generations. And so in this particular figure, which was created by two Indigenous artists and originally published in the Status of Tribes and Climate Change report from the Institute and of Tribal Environmental Professionals that Dominique referred to earlier, demonstrates all of these different ways in which intimate relationships with plants, animals, fish, ecosystems, in which scientific and engineering topics having to do with infrastructure, spiritual topics, past and future generations are all entwined in a way of thinking about the climate system and how it relates to key issues that people are facing today. And so this is definitely one of the advancements in the chapter to be able to continue to do more justice to the significance of Indigenous worldviews and Indigenous knowledge, and in ways that support our being able to continue to work together productively with scientists and other allies to articulate the issues that Indigenous people face regarding climate change, but also the solutions that Indigenous people have for climate change and the worldviews and knowledge that give rise to the solutions that Indigenous people have. And when I move to the next slide, I would like to reintroduce our colleague Nick again to discuss this in the next slide.
Thank you, Kyle. This fits well with Kyle's mention of key message 1 and is placed there in the report. This figure looks at the breadth of projects for renewable energy, funding that came from the US federal government directly to tribes. Data was pulled from EPA and BIA. And what's really interesting is to note the trends in renewable energy investment, and also the larger the bubble, the more projects. So from year to year, it's important to know kind of where priorities are based, where funding is going, and how there's been this push and an expansion and support of energy sovereignty across Indigenous communities and Native sovereign nations. Things to look at specifically is retrofitting, solar, and biomass investment, and how those have kind of ebbed and flowed over the past 10 years or so. Thank you. Next slide, please. Great. Kind of building off of what Dominique had mentioned about data sovereignty, this is shows both opportunity and also missed opportunity in the development of climate risk data. We have 3 data sets presented here in maps. One 100-year floodplain, or the 1% chance annual floodplain map that was a combination of EPA and FEMA data. We have wildfire risk and then drought data. All of these data sources came with federal funding, which provides free and accessible data to Indigenous communities and federally recognized tribes that want to use and incorporate this data in hazard mitigation planning or adaptation planning. However, often in the development of this data, there isn't appropriate consultation. Data sovereignty is also not often considered, and there's additional concerns over ownership and protection of this data. So it really sparks a conversation of opportunity and improvement in collaboration and development of this data. Often we have seen tribal nations and Indigenous communities look to non-government entities to help produce this data, or find workarounds and loopholes, and kind of directly work with other government programs to provide better data that fits their needs to better incorporate in climate adaptation and planning. Thank you so much. I'll pass it back to Kyle.
Thank you, Nick. And for the next set of slides, I'd like to introduce my colleague Chaz Jones.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Elisa, for helping us through this authorship process, which took quite a long time. And thank you, Dominique and Nick, for your leadership in the effort as well. I'm Chaz Jones, and I work for the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians as the Climate Resilience Program Director. And at ATNI, in our climate program, we do a lot of work to bring tribes together to share information and to provide training and workforce development for tribal folks, specifically in the Pacific Northwest, but across the nation as well. I was really honored to serve on the authorship team for this chapter, just because of the amazing folks that we had working on it, and really the inspiration that I find in presenting and sharing information about the efforts that tribes and Indigenous folks are using and the innovations that they're using to actually tackle climate change. And you'll find in the next 3 slides that I'm going to be presenting that tribes are really taking leadership in their approaches to how they are tackling the issue, whether it be through integrating science and traditional knowledges, their traditions, educating youth, educating young professionals, incorporating sustainability practices or their worldview into engineering processes, and developing science models, developing and sharing information with academics to help really inform the general world about how their worldview can help push climate forward and help become more climate resilient. And here in this slide, we have some examples from the Hopi Reservation that incorporates the longstanding traditions that the Hopi have used in soil conservation techniques that actually allows their 3 sisters, their corn, their beans, and the squash to grow together, not only to help the entire conglomeration of those foods to help them grow and thrive in a arid environment, but also to help and utilize the water to the maximum extent. The seeds that were used to grow these corn plants were they actually take the seeds that were from that were grown in drought years, and they pollinate them with other seeds that were grown in drought years, and year after year the plants become more and more drought tolerant as they harvest the seeds. You can also see how the traditional knowledge experts are actually working with the youth in the lower right image to actually share information about how the tribes, how their traditional knowledge is, and how the experience of growing corn in traditional ways will actually benefit them in the long term, and they will be able to carry that forward and share that with their future generations as well. And so really love to see that intergenerational sharing of knowledge and information. And then similarly, in that same area, we have an image here where you can see the traditional sandstone style of home of the Hopi Reservation actually being integrated with newer technologies such as solar and satellite Wi-Fi there. So you can just see that some of the indigenous indigenuity that's being applied at Hopi and in tribes across the nation is really taking the lead and showing others, providing examples of how traditional or how tribal innovation can actually benefit society in general. Can you go next slide? And here, and I apologize for anybody when I attempt to say this word, but I'm going to hack it no matter what. The Odanga Nation, they have their Cha Sanzwatha Firehouse and Community Hall that they developed, incorporating many sustainability practices. On the roof of this firehouse, they have a 100 kilowatt hour solar system that allows them to rely less on non-renewable energy sources. They also have a geothermal heating system that they incorporated into their firehouse. And when they designed the firehouse as a community gathering place and as a place that is the center for their public safety initiatives, they designed this house, but they designed this building and community hall with an eye towards sustainability, with an eye towards future generations. They wanted something that was going to carry forth for many years to come and do it in the best way possible. The title, the name of this firehouse, which I'm not going to attempt to hack again, but it means where they put it out. And the aspirations behind it were that it would be built by the people and a work of the Odanga Nation. And they really sought to walk gently upon the earth and to illustrate how they did that with not only their community, not only with their tribe, but also with the world as a whole. Next slide. Another example of ways that, and these are only a small number of examples of things that are being done by tribes, but they illustrate the indigenuity that's being applied by Indigenous peoples around the nation. But here, we're looking at a couple of the efforts by the Menominee Nation out of Wisconsin. And they have this phonology station on the college campus. And phonology, you can see that they use traditional language and traditional words on their sign here, but it really explains how the mismatch, how the climate change is actually affecting the mismatch of between the timing of botanical life cycle processes like the blooming of the flowers, the leafing of the trees, the leafing, the emergence of the insects to actually pollinate those trees. And it's really highlighting the mismatch of how climate change is actually affecting their ability to rely on traditional knowledge, or to rely on traditional knowledges that was based on that phenological processes and those patterns that they've generated and observed over millennia. But then it also allows them to, they use this type of information. They also develop this theoretical model of sustainability, which you can see it highlights how the human system in the center actually is affected by the economics, the human perception, activity, behavior, land sovereignty, natural environment, institutions, and technology. And folks that are non-Indigenous are taking these types of models, these types of information, and applying other knowledge types from Western science, from social systems, from economics. They're applying all of these into this model and other models that are being developed around the nation to actually try to gain insights into the impacts that climate has more generally. The last thing I'm going to mention, I was going to do it during my introduction, I forgot, but in April, the affiliated tribes, Northwest Indians that I work for, we are hosting the 2024 National Tribal Leaders Climate Summit, and registration is open. And I'll put a link in the chat. I'd love to see you all show up and come out to Muckleshoot in the Seattle area to join us for that summit. Thank you so much. I'll kick it back over to Kyle. Appreciate you all for being here.
Thank you very much, Chaz, for sharing the examples, some of the examples that we discuss in the chapter. And I want to just express gratitude to the entire author team that participated. As our colleague Eliza had shared, in the world of scientific assessments, the National Climate Assessment stands out as one that has one of the most rigorous peer review processes and one of the most rigorous scientific processes. And so you develop relationships with your author team that last forever. There are many challenges, many things to respond to. And with regard to our chapter, one of the things that I want to uplift is that there are many hundreds of Indigenous people, hundreds of cultures, life experiences, situations. Indigenous people are everywhere in big cities and small towns, in Indigenous jurisdictions, all across the US sphere. And so this chapter takes on a really heavy task to be able to support the aspirations of diverse Indigenous people and to really try to do its best to give respect to just the incredible differences, the incredible struggles and successes that Indigenous people are wrapped up in everywhere. And we look forward to future iterations of this work and future national climate assessments, and just want to uplift the idea that when Indigenous people are able to be in leading positions and author positions, are able to express their own scientific rigor, that we're able to produce powerful chapters and powerful contributions to scientific assessments. And so we hope that all of you and people nationally and internationally are able to use and cite the chapter and use this as a building block to advance the work that you all are doing. We wrote this chapter, we did all the work to produce this chapter for the sake of advancing all of the individual projects and all of the different interests that many of you here have, in the spirit of the importance of developing credible knowledge about climate change. You can check out the chapter, the full one, at the link here, publicly available. There's also more information to connect to the U.S. Global Change Research Program and all of the key information that they've developed on climate change and that this report emphasizes and highlights. So as we move into our question and answer period, I'd like to return to our colleague, Eliza, to move us into that phase.